Hi everyone, I'm back with another video. My name is Monica and I am the founder of Reparations Ed. And at Reparations Ed, I support educators in advancing equity for Black students. So I'm back again because I want to continue the conversation that I started last video about implicit bias. I really believe that implicit bias is one of the most important topics for educators to fully grasp. Now, in the last video, I told you about how I've been reading about and researching implicit bias for a long time. I took a course recently from Harvard Online and I earned a certificate. The course was called Unpacking Implicit Bias. So it's been on my mind lately, and I want to share with you a definition that the course gave me about implicit bias. Implicit bias is attitudes or associations that we hold in our minds that we are unaware of. Keyword unaware. So it's like we have these hidden stereotypes that we've absorbed from the media, from books, from TV, from family beliefs, from social media, from all these different places. We absorb these stereotypes. And in America, there is a lot of anti-blackness that we absorb. And even though we might think that we are, quote unquote, not racist, or that we don't treat Black people differently, or we don't treat, this whatever group differently, we do. And it's implicit. We're unaware of it. So let me give you an example of something that I witnessed probably about a year ago, working in my previous role as a director at an education nonprofit. So one of the things that I would do in that role was support instructors who were doing reading intervention with students. And one of the ways I would support them is by observing them. And so there was a new ish instructor who had started, and she knew I was coming to observe her teaching a small group of kindergartners using this scripted phonics program. So I went in to observe her. She had about 5 students at her table, and there was a white boy and a black boy and a white girl sitting next to each other, 2 5-year-olds. And from my vantage point, I could see that they were both kicking each other under the table equally. There wasn't that one was kicking more than the other. They were both kicking each other. She couldn't really tell from where she was sitting that this was happening underneath the table. And I didn't say anything. Finally, she caught wind of what was happening. And immediately, who do you think she disciplined first? She disciplined the black boy first. And she, kind of scolded him and then had him move to another seat, never saying anything to the white little girl. After that happened, at the end of the session, she took the students back to class, and her and I had a little bit of time to debrief. I did point that out to her. And she had learned a little bit about implicit bias because of some coursework that I had created while working at that particular job. And so we had a conversation. That moment of implicit bias happens all the time. I'm sure you've done that before. I know I've done that before. We hold those stereotypes and we don't even know that we're acting on those. And so to me, there is the bias of him being a boy, and we tend to see boys as being more aggressive and tend to see them as needing more discipline. And then there's the bias of him being a black boy, whereas we've been conditioned to associate blackness with aggression, with criminality, because that's what we see on TV and in the media. And so when you see a black boy, then, and a white girl, and there's some type of altercation, then you automatically zero in on the black boy as being the culprit. He's the one that needs discipline. He's the one who's getting in trouble. And imagine that happening throughout a black little boy's school career. Okay, so let me give you another example because I love examples when explaining implicit bias because it just illustrates it a bit more. So, a long time ago, when my son was 5 years old, okay, my son is grown now, but when he was 5 years old, he had some challenges when he first went to kindergarten. He, was used to being an only child and used to being able to play and not have to share, and he was a little rambunctious, he was a little bit more active than other students, and that's okay. He was 5 years old. The teacher had challenges too with being able to support him. And I guess he had hit someone in class, and I don't remember what else he may have done. But again, we're talking about a 5-year old. So there was a meeting that was called, and it was me and my son's father, the teacher, I think the counselor, maybe the assistant principal was at this meeting to talk about my son's behavior. And my son was going to school in a predominantly white school district, mostly white teachers. I don't think there were any teachers of color, and this particular teacher was white, but that's okay. I only mention that to paint the picture. I just want you to know anybody can have bias. You don't have to be white to have implicit bias. During the conversation, when the teacher was explaining my son's behavior and talking about what he had done, she was she was getting upset, because I guess she felt like, he was disruptive. And she looked at me and my son's father and said, "You should just drive him past a prison or something." And back then, I didn't have any awareness of bias. I certainly hadn't been educated about, you know, systemic racism to the level that I am now. And I didn't really have, I didn't know how to advocate for my son or what to do in that situation. So I didn't really say anything, and the conversation continued. But I always remember that because in that moment, she was criminalizing my 5-year old. She saw prison in his future. So I think about that because if you're an educator out there or an administrator or a parent, I want you to be aware of those biases. Are you holding some of those? Have you said some of these things? I'm not here to blame. I don't want you to go out and point out what other people have done. I just want you to think about how it's showing up and what you can do about it, because awareness is everything. Once we're aware of something, we can start to change it. We can start to monitor ourselves. We can start to interrogate our biases. So, bias is everywhere. Everybody has it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. But let's talk a little bit more about where bias shows up in schools. It shows up in several different ways. One of the ways is low expectations for students of color. That's a big way that we show bias, is that we don't have a lot of expectations for our students of color, our immigrant students, our Black students, you know, low expectations. We're not always expecting them to be the best and the brightest in general. Now, you may not have that bias, and that's okay. I'm speaking in general terms. Another way that bias shows up in schools is over disciplining students of color, especially Black boys. And I talked about that in the last video, and that is a fact because I spoke about the data that was gathered from the US Department of Education. I talked about local data where I live here in Dallas, and it shows that Black boys are disproportionately receive exclusionary discipline. Another way it shows up is assuming that students of color, immigrants, and special education students don't have gifts and talents. We expect them to need more help and more support. Just because their first language isn't English, something in our brains tells us that they're not capable. They're not as smart because they don't speak the language. And that's just not true. Another way that bias shows up is that sometimes as educators, we believe that white middle class culture is something for people to aspire to. We want them to assimilate into our cultural norms. And normally, for a lot of us, our cultural norms are based off of white middle class culture. And so we think that that is something for others to aspire to, rather than uplifting and learning about their culture and their ways of being. We want to push that aside in order for them to assimilate into what we want. Those are just a few ways that bias can show up. The last thing I want to point out is when I talked about low expectations a few minutes ago, it made me think about how biased gifted and talented selection is. And I've researched this, and there's not a whole lot of current data about gifted and national data about gifted and talented selection, but you can go and look, and I'll link in the description below. I'll link the website where you can look up your school district where you work and see how the demographics of gifted and talented selection. You can probably guess that there are more white and Asian students chosen for GT programs than Black and Hispanic students nationally. And I looked at some local data as well. I looked at some data for Plano ISD, which is where where my son went to school. Okay, so just to illustrate my point about gifted and talented selection, I looked at Plano ISD. Plano is a suburb of Dallas, it's north of Dallas. It has a white population of 31%, a Asian population of 24%, 26% Hispanic, and 13% Black. That's the school's population. And I'm looking at their website now. I think this was from, oh, this is from 2020-2021 school year. Although the school district is 31% white students make up 39% of the gifted and talented program. They represent 39%. Asian students are 24% of the population, but they are also 39% of the students in gifted and talented. Black students are 13% of the general school population, but only 4% of those selected for gifted and talented. Hispanic students are 26% of the school population in Plano ISD, and they are only 13% of those chosen for gifted and talented programs. So my question to you is, why is it so disproportionate? Why are more white and Asian students selected for GT programs than Black and Hispanic students? Is it because white and Asian students are smarter? Are you going to believe the model minority myth about Asian students that tells us that they're smarter, they're better at math? Or is it because of our bias? And our bias leads us to have higher expectations for those students. Students live up to your expectations. The higher your expectations, the students will rise to the occasion. We have higher expectations for white and Asian students. We believe they're more capable, and so we push them into those programs. We tend to have lower expectations for Black students, Hispanic students, immigrant students, poor students, special education students, and those students are typically not chosen for gifted and talented programs. And also, the last thing I'll say is that gifted and talented programs have a little bit of a racist origin. They have a racist origin because they were created once white flight happened and white families started leaving major suburban school or major urban school districts and going to suburbs, going to private schools, etc. Public schools created these programs to get those white students back. Like, oh, we have this special gifted program that your student can be in if you come back to public schools. So there was already some bias with the creation of these programs. And why can't we just offer enrichment to all students? You know, why does it have to be this exclusive thing? But I definitely encourage you to do some research about implicit bias. Think about it in your interactions with your students. And let me know in the comments below how it's going. See you next time.